Our message affirmation today is I am a rich child of God, and we all absolutely are. And in our fellowship, we use affirmations a lot. And an affirmation, of course, is a statement of something we know to be true. It's not something we're asking for, we're reaching for. We're just affirming something that we already know is true. And it's already true that we are all rich children of God. And even if at this moment you look down in your pocketbook or your checking account and it's not as big and voluminous as you'd like it to be, you are a rich child of God. And so we need only work on the steps to get us there to that point where we have all that wealth and abundance that we are meant to have. And this morning, we're going to be talking about prosperity. Yesterday, I came to church and I went through our library because there's wonderful, wonderful unity writings down there. And as is often the case, I'll just go and peruse something, and it's such a great thing to be part of unity because we have so many prolific, wonderful writers about unity who understand our faith tradition so well, and they write about it so well. And I came across a great little book, and I sat down to reading it, and it was actually titled the same as our study guide here, Prosperity's 10 Commandments. And what it is it's a metaphysical interpretation of the 10 Commandments, and it talks about prosperity. And so this, I thought, was so wonderful to talk about because it's always good to talk about prosperity. And we know that we don't like to talk about lack or limit because we don't want to bring that into our world. So we can always talk about prosperity because that brings in the things that we need. And I was so delighted. I think I even yelled out. Much to my surprise, the daily word was prosperity. I thought, wow, this is so appropriate today. So I didn't plan it backwards. It actually happened the other way. So I think that it was very, very much Spirit guiding and directing me to select that book, as it always does, and to talk about prosperity. Now, as I mentioned, this is a metaphysical, a new thought interpretation of the 10 Commandments. And it's a lot of information to go through. And then on the other side, the author has created an affirmation to go along with each of the commandments. So we're going to do this in two parts because the first of these, like the 10 Commandments, deal with our relationship with God. The last deal more with our relationship with man, with other people, and in the world. So today we're going to talk about the first of these prosperity 10 commandments and our relationship with God in them. And the first one is, thou shalt look to no other source but God for thy supply. And this is a wonderful thing to realize, and we sing about this a lot, and I was so delighted. I think that was one of our songs about God is the source of our supply. Because as much as we think it's our job, or it's our annuity, or our pension check, or our great Uncle Phineas sending us checks, everybody, all of that, those are just messengers. That's like the middleman. God is the source of everything. Everything that we get, everything that we receive comes from God. And this becomes very important because when we find ourselves in that circumstance or situation, maybe we've lost our job, or you know what, Uncle Phineas died and he didn't leave us in his will, or you know, any number of things that can happen that can interrupt what we think is our flow of prosperity. God is always there for us, and God has so many channels, so many avenues, and what we need to do to access them and to be aligned with that presence and that power is to not lose faith and not let things like fear and worry and doubt creep in, because those are the things that cause the block. Those are the things that block our prosperity. And, I'm not just sitting up here talking about this because, it's what I do as a minister. I live this, and I know so many times, because in addition to working here in the church, I am a small business owner, and so I have things like payroll and health insurance and rent and all these things for the business as well as my own personal life. And I do get to that point where I feel overwhelmed with worry and fear and anxiety. And I have to so often stop and take a few steps back and understand that these things are blocking my prosperity and I have to get them out of my system. But it's human nature. It's human nature. So don't, first of all, don't beat yourself up if you haven't always been the person to set aside and not let fear and worry and anxiety get to you, because that's human nature. And we know that we're spiritual beings, but we live the human experience. And so you're going to have that things. And so Being as we are, we call ourselves New Thought students. We're always learning, we're always growing. So these are the things that we learn and we grow, and we learn how not to let worry and fear and doubt and anxiety come in and block us from our good. And one of the first ways to understand and realize that is to understand that no matter what, God is the source of our supply. No outside source, no outside person. It all comes from God, even though there's middleman, there's the different channels that it comes to us. But in every circumstance, in every situation, always realize that God is the source of our supply. And a wonderful reference to this is, and earlier we sang the Lord's Prayer, and some of the disciples asked Jesus, well, how do we pray? And he said, well, this is how you pray. This is what you say. And he recited the Lord's Prayer. So we start saying, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. And so we know Christ, the Wayshower, right there was telling us that, you know what, it's God you go to. God is the source of your daily bread in everything, in every circumstance, in every situation. It's God that this supply is coming from. And so this is a great reminder to go back, and if you find yourself in that place of worry or fear or doubt because, you know what, your pocketbook's a little empty or the checking account isn't the level it needs to be, go and remember this prayer and know that all things come from God, because our Father who art in heaven is going to give us our daily bread every day, in every circumstance and every situation. And so a wonderful affirmation for that also is, I look only to God for my prosperity. So we need to be mindful as men not to praise the things that a lot of people do. You don't, before you open up the newspaper to check out the stock quotes, or before you do any number of things that people do that they associate with their source of wealth, start by thanking and affirming God. Start with this, I look only to God for my prosperity. And our next commandment is, thou shalt make no mental images of lack. In so many circumstances and situations, we hear people around us all the time, and a lot of times it becomes our vocabulary, a part of our vernacular, when we start having these images and we think, oh my gosh, you know what, that's not going to work out. Oh, I'm never going to get that payment until, oh gosh, I'd love to have that, but I could never afford that. All of these things that come into our mind, all these mental images of lack or limit or fear that block our prosperity. And again, we're human beings, this happens. And so we need to be good truth students, and we need to work on eliminating these things from our mind, because we know that we are indeed rich children of God, that God is the source of our daily bread. So when we get to that circumstance or situation where the checkbook is low, or you know what, the wolf is out the door, or the landlord's out the door, or on the phone, and you don't have the resources, rather than, don't conjure up these mental images of being homeless on the streets, or, living in your car, or panhandling, put these images of these riches coming to you from God, because God is the source of your supply in every circumstance and every situation. And the affirmation to remind ourselves when we find ourselves in that circumstance or situation where we are letting these images come into our mind because fear, doubt, or worry has taken over and let our better side, our better thoughts, our knowing better, go to the wayside, because this is what we think we see in our immediate future, is this lack or this limit or this terrifying situation. Remind ourselves and affirm, I make no mental images of lack. I make no mental images of lack. So when something starts flashing in your mind that's negative, drown it out with this positive affirmation. I make no mental images of lack. And as we talk so often, there is no lack and there is no limit, because God is the source of our supply. And the third commandment that we're going to go over today is, thou shalt not speak the word of lack or limitation. And this is so important, because I hear so often people say this, and when I remind them, even in our fellowships, sometimes in the social hour, people, well, I don't have the money for that, or I don't know how that's going to happen. And you remind people, they say, well, I'm just saying that in passing. Even the most innocuous, innocent of words is energy. It's something you're putting out into the universe. So we have to be mindful. We have to be good New Thought students and be mindful not to speak words of lack or limit, and not put that out into the universe. As I've been saying all morning, of course, we're humans and we fall into this human situation. And we know that sometimes we open up the checkbook and it's not going to cover everything that we need to do. And so we might speak words of lack or limit. Or, as is so often the case, when the knock is at the door, or the landlord's on the phone, or the car payment company, or whatever, sometimes the first thing out of our mouth is, well, I don't have the money for that. I don't have the money. I can't afford that. And all these words of lack and limitation, they just precipitate it. They just keep your lack and limit going. Whereas when we find ourselves in this situation, in this circumstance or situation, where at that moment, it's not in your checkbook, but rather than affirming something negative, because that's what we're doing, we're affirming and creating it by speaking these words of lack or limit, we say, the prosperity is just around the corner from me. The prosperity is just around the corner. The prosperity is on its way. The prosperity is on its way. I know it. I can feel it. So even if at that moment you don't have the resources to pay the need of, what everybody's calling for, rather than bemoaning or talking, as Catherine Ponder put it, poor mouth. I'd never heard that expression before I read her, but she says in her writings, and the dynamic laws of prosperity is, don't put on a poor mouth. Don't talk poor mouth, because if you talk poor, you're going to get poor results, because there's so much power in our words. So, thou shalt not speak the word of lack or limitation. And the affirmation that goes with that, when you find yourself in that circumstance or situation, affirm to yourself, I speak no words of limitation. I speak no words of limitation. I speak no words of limitation. And affirm always, my prosperity is just around the corner. My prosperity is just around the corner. And our fourth commandment that we're going to go over today is, thou shalt let go and let God do it. When I first read that, I thought, well, that's a little vague. And of course, all of these have very long descriptions, and it's really wonderful. And the great example that was given by the author was the reference to a farmer. A farmer plants a seed. So actually it begins, he goes and he selects the seed. And then he goes back to his farm and he tills and prepares the soil. And of course he has to water the soil. And along the way he has to pull weeds to make sure that the weeds don't choke out the plant. But other than that, the rest is up to God, because the farmer has no part in that first root shooting out, no part in that first sprig coming up through the soil, no part in that first flower forming, and certainly no part in that flower turning into the fruit that he will eventually reap and gain his harvest from. That is God's work. And so we have to be mindful to plant our seeds, sow them. Yes, we have to keep it watered, and we certainly have to keep the weeds pulled, but the rest, not force, not push, not always be on, because that's God's work. That's what God is going to do. And when you think about this wonderful scenario of the relationship between the farmer and these universal laws of God, what the farmer does is so small in comparison to what God is doing. God is doing the greatest of the work. He's creating this tiny little capsule pod. He's turning into this wonderful, wonderful fruit or vegetable or some great harvest for the farmer. And so the farmer, as farmers do, has to let go and let God do his perfect work. So when you find yourself in this circumstance or situation, when you've planted that seed of prosperity in your mind, we need to go on with our work, go on with our daily things, and be mindful to pull the weeds. And I'm likening that to the negativity. So I actually was yesterday after this thinking of some economic challenges, and whenever I would think of anything, I'd imagine it as a weed. I'm pulling that negative thought. I'm pulling that negative thought. So when we are in this circumstance or situation, we plant that seed of prosperity and we thank God. And we move on, and we let God do his perfect work. We don't bang on every day and get down on our knees and beg and plead and do all the things that so often we see people doing when they are asking something of God, because God is your Father. He wants for you all wonderful things. He wants you to have a life of great happiness, great health, and absolutely great prosperity and great abundance. And so you plant that seed of prosperity and you let it go. You let God do his perfect work. And along the way, be mindful. You pull those weeds of negativity. You pull those weeds of negative words or negative thoughts from your mind, and you let God do his perfect work, because there is no other source but God for our supply. So we know that that God is the source of our supply. So we plant that seed of thought in our mind, that prosperity thought, and we go on and we let God do his work, because the farmer's sitting there trying to yank at that seed to get the root to grow or the sprout to come up. It's not going to happen. That's God's work to do. So we leave that for God to do. And we do that in our lives with all of the things that we have going on, with our prosperity needs. We just let God do his perfect work. We let go and we let God do it in every circumstance and every situation. So the affirmation for that commandment is, I let go and let God work in my affairs. I let go and I let God work in my affairs. I let go and I let God work in my affairs. So I'm not on my knees 24 hours a day begging and pleading and cajoling with God, because I know I've planted that seed. My job is to keep the negativity away, and God is going to do the rest of the work. And that's a wonderful thing to know and accept, and challenging as human beings to believe. But as spiritual beings, we know that to be a spiritual truth. And so we hold on to that and we let that be our reality. All right. I'd like to invite you now to join me in prayer. Eternal and loving God, we thank you so much for your wonderful laws of abundance. We thank you for the prosperity that we know is ours in life. We thank you for being our complete source of supply, Lord. And we thank you for giving us these tools to let us weed out thoughts and deeds of negativity and words of negativity, and for indeed doing all the work as we sit by and we wait for your perfect plan to unfold. We thank you, Lord, in the name of faith, hope, and love. Amen.